Imagine you're holding a piece of unleavened bread. It's just this ordinary, quiet moment. And then right before your eyes, a reddish liquid begins to seep from the
Yeah,
center.
you don't just call a priest for something like that. You call a forensic biologist.
Exactly. So today we are doing a deep dive into a really fascinating 2026 PhD dissertation. It takes this claimed supernatural event and literally puts it under a microscope.
We're looking at the 2006 claimed Eucharistic miracle in Tixla, Mexico. And, I mean, it is an incredible document.
Really is.
The author takes us to the absolute ragged edge of where science, forensic methodology, and the philosophy of design detection all sort of collide.
Right. And, before we really get into the weeds here, the lab results and the DNA testing, I want to say something directly to you listening right now.
Yeah, that's important to frame up front.
Definitely. The source material today touches on some highly sensitive, religiously charged claims. So we are impartially reporting on the contents of this academic dissertation. We are not endorsing any theological viewpoints, taking sides, or validating the beliefs of any group. Our goal is simply to convey the fascinating forensic and philosophical ideas contained in this original source material.
Which is vital because, evaluating a miracle claim requires us to define what we're even looking for in the first place.
Yeah.
The dissertation actually opens with this brilliant framework for this, borrowing from Carl Sagan's sci-fi novel, Contact.
Oh, right. The one where they find the alien signal?
That's the one. But specifically, it focuses on the very end of the novel. Sagan presents this thought experiment where advanced extraterrestrials actually manipulate the fundamental constants of the universe.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, they do it to hide a message deep inside the digits of pi. It's a string of ones and zeros that perfectly form a circle.
Huh.
The implication there is that this message is a signature. It's this mathematical anomaly that could only be recognized by a civilization advanced enough to calculate those constants. So the author uses this as a metaphor for a divine fingerprint.
Like a scientifically detectable anomaly that just screams, an intelligent agent was here?
Exactly.
And the dissertation connects that to Catholic theology, right?
Yeah.
Specifically, the doctrine of transubstantiation. Now, I know a little bit of the Aristotelian philosophy behind this.
Oh, let's hear it.
Well, the idea is that during Mass, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, but the accidents, the physical taste, the texture, the molecular structure of the bread, they remain exactly the same.
Right, well, the underlying substance changes. But a Eucharistic miracle is a claimed event where those Aristotelian accidents actually change.
So the physical appearance visibly transforms into human flesh and blood.
Yes, and if you could verify that in a modern laboratory, it would be the theological equivalent of finding Sagan's message inside pi.
That makes sense. It would be a physical, testable, divine fingerprint.
Exactly.
So how does science try to measure a divine fingerprint? Let's go to the catalyst for this entire academic paper. The date is October 21st, 2006.
Right, in Mexico.
Yeah, at the St. Martin of Tours parish in Tixla, Guerrero, there's a religious retreat happening. Sister Arlie Mariquin is distributing Holy Communion.
Okay.
And as she returns the ciborium, which is the container holding the communion wafers back to the tabernacle, she notices something. One of the consecrated hosts is emitting a reddish substance.
You can just imagine the emotional electricity in the room. I mean, a religious retreat is already a space of heightened spiritual anticipation.
Oh, totally. Bishop Alejo Zavala Castro is notified immediately. The host is locked down in the tabernacle, and a formal chain of custody begins.
Which is standard protocol for them.
Right. Now, my first thought reading this was that, this must be an isolated incident. But the dissertation zooms out and points to this massive historical pattern.
Yeah, Tixla is part of a very specific lineage of claims. The text outlines several major precedent cases.
Like which ones?
Well, the most famous is Lanciano, Italy, which dates all the way back to the 8th century. That one was actually investigated by scientists in the 1970s.
Wow, that long ago.
Yeah. Then you have Buenos Aires in 1996. Later, Lanica, Poland in 2013. And here's the crazy part. When investigators publish their findings on these cases, the profile is shockingly consistent.
What do they usually find?
They almost always report finding human cardiac tissue, specifically from the left ventricle, and they report an AB blood type.
Okay, when I see that kind of consistency, my brain immediately thinks, well, there's the signal and the noise.
Right, it feels like proof.
Yeah. If you're looking for a divine fingerprint, finding the exact same blood type and the exact same heart muscle across different centuries and continents, It sounds incredibly compelling.
It does sound compelling. Until you apply a psychological concept, the dissertation leans on pretty heavily. It's called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Okay, let me see if I can translate this to a modern equivalent. Is this like one of those financial gurus online who predicts a specific stock will skyrocket?
Okay, I see where you're going.
And when it does, everyone calls him a genius. But what they don't see is that he secretly emailed 1 million people with different stock predictions and only publicly highlighted the one he got right.
That is the exact mechanism of the fallacy, yeah.
Yeah.
You fire a shotgun at a barn wall, and then you walk up and paint a bullseye around the tightest cluster of bullet holes.
Making it look like you have perfect aim.
Exactly. Think about the denominator here. Millions of consecrated hosts are consumed globally every single day.
Right.
Over centuries. That is billions of data points. Only a microscopic fraction are ever reported as anomalous, and those are the only ones investigators look at.
Because you're actively filtering out 1 billion data points of, normal bread.
Precisely. And furthermore, consider investigator bias. If an investigator tests a reddish spot on a host and finds a common fungus, they throw it away.
It doesn't make the news?
No, it doesn't get published as a miracle. But if they test it and find human blood, it becomes an international phenomenon.
So it skews the data.
Heavily. We have to ask, is the consistency across Lanciano, Buenos Aires, and Tixla a sign of divine consistency? Or is it a statistical artifact fueled by massive selection bias, where we only ever hear about the hits?
Okay, let's unpack this and apply that skepticism to the Tixla timeline, because I actually found myself pushing back on the author here a bit.
Oh, really? How come?
Well, the diocese set up a chain of custody on day 1. They lock the host in the tabernacle. From a forensic standpoint, securing the evidence immediately is gold, isn't it? Why is the dissertation so critical of the timeline?
It comes down to a concept the paper calls the miracle window.
The miracle window.
Yeah. The chain of custody documents the artifact's life after the observation, but it tells us absolutely zero about the critical minutes, hours, or days before Sister Airlie noticed the reddish substance.
Oh, I see.
She made the initial observation while handling the ciborium. There were no independent, objective monitors recording the actual moment of transformation.
So there's no CCTV footage of the bread spontaneously turning into blood?
No. And far more concerning for the forensic profile is the testing delay. The event happened in 2006, right?
Right.
The scientific investigation didn't commence until 2009.
Wait, a 3-year gap? If I leave a sandwich on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks, it's an unrecognizable science experiment.
Exactly.
Waiting 3 years to test organic material seems completely counterproductive.
Biological materials degrade rapidly.
Yeah.
If you wait 3 years to test something, you aren't testing the event itself.
You're testing whatever's left over.
Right. What have survived 3 years of degradation? Or worse, whatever biological material might have been introduced to the artifact during that unmonitored window.
Which brings us to the actual laboratory findings from 2009 to 2012.
Well,
Because despite that 3-year gap, the initial reports sound absolutely bulletproof.
they do on paper.
Yeah. The lead investigator, Dr. Ricardo Castellan-Gomez, and his team reported an astonishing list of findings. They found human hemoglobin, they verified the AB blood type, and they found intact red blood cells. Plus, they found active macrophages, which are white blood cells actually in the process of engulfing lipids, and tissue with the branching fibers characteristic of cardiac muscle.
What's fascinating here is when you lay it out like that, it sounds like undeniable proof.
Doesn't it?
But the dissertation completely dismantles this by revealing that these exact findings create massive, glaring biological contradictions. The author calls the first one the freshness paradox.
Okay, break that down for me, because if a lab tells me they found intact red blood cells, my layperson brain just thinks, wow, the blood magically survived.
I mean, that's a natural reaction.
Right.
But red blood cells don't just sit around waiting to be tested. Inside your circulating bloodstream, a red blood cell lives for about 120 days.
Okay.
Outside the body, it undergoes a process called lysing. The cell membrane literally ruptures because it can no longer maintain osmotic pressure. This happens within days, sometimes weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yet, investigators claim to have found fully intact red blood cells 3 years later on a dry wafer, kept at room temperature with no visible preservatives.
That makes no sense. And what about the white blood cells, the macrophages? You said they were active.
That is the most glaring impossibility. A macrophage is essentially a microscopic garbage disposal. To be active, to be caught under a microscope actively engulfing a lipid, it requires energy.
Right, they need fuel.
It requires ATP. It requires warmth, usually 37 degrees Celsius. Macrophages require strict, living tissue culture conditions with specialized nutrient broths to survive and function outside a human body.
They don't just hang out on a dry piece of bread in a church tabernacle for 3 years performing cellular functions.
Exactly.
So either the laws of cellular biology were suspended, which, I mean, is the definition of a miracle, or someone recently introduced fresh biological material right before the 2009 testing, or the investigators are just completely misidentifying what they're looking
The
at.
contradictions compound even more when you look at the DNA evidence.
Right. The source points out a massive discrepancy here. The investigators reported finding human DNA, but they explicitly noted in their findings that the DNA was fragmented.
Yeah.
Now, let me see if I'm understanding the biology here. Think of a cell like a functioning factory, and the DNA is the master blueprint in the manager's office.
Good analogy.
You can't have a fully functioning active factory, which is what a living, eating macrophage cell is, if the blueprints have been run through an industrial shredder.
Nope.
Fragmented DNA means the cell has undergone apoptosis or necrosis. It's dead.
You cannot have living, metabolically active cells coexisting with fragmented, degraded DNA in the same unpreserved sample. It is a literal biological paradox.
So why on earth didn't the original investigators see a paradox like that as a giant red flag?
Well, it's because of the paradigm they were working within. When your framework allows for the supernatural, biological anomalies aren't red flags.
Oh, they're seen as features, not bugs.
Exactly. They are interpreted as further proof of the miraculous. The dead, shredded DNA and the supposedly living cells were both accepted as evidence of a divine suspension of natural laws. It didn't prompt the investigators to question their own assays.
But because they accepted the paradoxes, they completely missed a naturalistic explanation that the dissertation argues is just staring them in the face.
Yeah, they missed a massive alternative.
The paper shifts its focus to what it calls technological forensics, and here's where it gets really interesting. I need you to explain this to me.
Sure.
How can tissue physically look exactly like heart muscle under a microscope with all the branching fibers, but test negative for desmin and myosin?
Okay, so desmin and myosin are the critical molecular markers of muscle. They are the contractile protein.
They're the pistons in the engine.
Exactly. So if they're missing, it's like finding a car that looks like a Ferrari on the outside, but when you pop the hood, there's no engine block. It's just an empty shell.
How does a piece of tissue become an empty shell, though?
This is the dissertation's most significant revelation. The absence of desmin and myosin, combined with the structural appearance of a heart, perfectly matches the profile of decellularized tissue scaffolds.
Okay, I want to guess how this works. Decellularized, so they are somehow removing the cells from the tissue, like washing it.
That is essentially what it is. By 2006, the field of tissue engineering and regenerative medicine was already doing this.
Really? That early?
Yeah. Scientists developed protocols using specific chemical detergents, like SDS, to take animal heart tissue, often from pigs, or sometimes human medical waste, and literally wash away all the cellular material.
Wow.
The detergents strip out the DNA, the desmin, the myosin, and the actual living cells.
Leaving behind what, exactly?
Just the extracellular matrix,
Yeah.
the collagen scaffolding, the architectural branching fibers of the heart. The structure remains perfectly intact, but the biological identity is wiped clean.
So under a microscope, the physical architecture looks structurally like a heart, which completely fools the investigators. But chemically, the muscle markers are just gone.
Precisely.
The negative test for desmin and myosin isn't a miraculous anomaly. It's definitive proof that you're likely looking at heavily processed, manufactured biological material.
The dissertation argues that the forensic profile is a perfect match for a 2006-era tissue scaffold.
But wait, what about the rest of the profile? If someone used a decellularized pig heart scaffold, they still had to fake the fresh blood, the human hemoglobin, and the AB blood type.
Right.
Was that kind of biotechnology even accessible back in 2006?
The dissertation systematically breaks down the 2006-era tech, and it is eye-opening. Take the human hemoglobin, for example.
Okay.
The diagnostic tests the investigators used could not distinguish between fresh human blood drawn from a vein and HbOCs.
Right.
Those are hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers.
What are those, like blood substitutes?
Yes. They are highly purified solutions of hemoglobin designed for trauma situations. By 2006, products like Hemopure and Polyheme were already well into clinical trials or approved in certain countries.
So you could just get it?
Yeah, you could source highly purified oxygen-carrying hemoglobin without ever needing a fresh human blood draw.
Okay, but what about the freshness paradox we talked about earlier? The original investigators specifically noted that the blood on the outside of the host was coagulated and dry, right?
Yes, they did.
But when they cut into it, the blood on the inside was miraculously fresh and liquid.
There are actually a couple of established ways 2006 technology could achieve that exact effect. One is lyophilization, which is commonly known as freeze-drying.
Like a astronaut ice cream.
A very similar process, yeah. You can freeze-dry blood products, removing the water through sublimation, and they remain completely stable at room temperature for years as a powder.
Oh, I see.
If that powder is exposed to ambient humidity in the air, the outer layer will reconstitute and coagulate, creating a crust. But the inside remains dry and preserved until it is physically broken open or hydrated.
That perfectly explains the crust on the outside and the preservation on the inside.
Another method the author highlights is encapsulation. Using substances like alginate hydrogels, tissue engineers can microencapsulate biological cells.
How does that work?
The gel acts as a protective moisture barrier. It preserves the biological activity inside while the outside remains completely dry. This kind of cell preservation was standard practice in biomedical labs by 2006.
This is a staggering realization. I mean, if 2006 biotechnology can perfectly explain every single anomalous finding down to the molecular level, the scaffold, the blood substitutes, the preservation, we have to ask the obvious question.
Which is?
Why did the scientific investigators and ultimately the diocese declare it a miracle? Which kind of brings us to the intersection of institutional blind spots and human psychology.
Right. When you examine the methodology of the 2009 to 2012 investigation, it was disastrously flawed from a scientific perspective. For one, they failed to utilize any control groups.
Wait, really? They didn't test normal communion wafers?
No control studies were published at all. If you're testing a wafer made of wheat for the presence of human hemoglobin using a crude colorimetric assay, you desperately need to know the false positive rate of that test on normal wheat wafers.
Because the wheat itself could react.
Exactly. Plant peroxidases in wheat can sometimes trigger false positives in blood tests. By not testing a normal host, they had absolutely no baseline.
That is just science 101. What else did they miss?
The laboratories performing the test weren't blinded. The labs were told they were testing artifacts from a potential religious miracle.
Oh, that's a huge problem.
In science, blinding is crucial because it prevents subconscious bias. If a lab tech knows they're testing a miracle, they might subconsciously interpret background noise in an assay as a positive result.
And then there is the lead investigator himself. Dr. Castañón Gómez was the exact same investigator who led the 1996 Buenos Aires case.
Which introduces a massive risk for confirmation bias. If you built your professional reputation finding AB blood and cardiac tissue in Argentina in 1996, and you deploy the exact same methods in Mexico 13 years later,
You are highly primed to find and accept the exact same result.
you have a hammer and everything starts looking like a nail.
It's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy again, but this time operating inside the laboratory. And this highlights a massive contrast in institutional standards.
Yes, it really does.
Because the local diocese of Chilpancingo, Chilapa officially approved the miracle in 2013, but their criteria for approval are entirely different than a scientific body's criteria, aren't they?
Very different. The diocese evaluates these events primarily through a pastoral lens. They look at the spiritual fruits. Does it inspire local devotion? Is it theologically appropriate?
Right.
They have a different burden of proof than the Vatican or the secular scientific community. The Vatican has not given its official approval to this miracle.
And critically, the only peer-reviewed secular analysis of this event, which was published by Arnaiz Vilena and colleagues in 2018, highlighted these exact methodological flaws.
Which really speaks to the overwhelming power of expectation. If you're at a highly charged religious retreat and you see a reddish discoloration on a host,
Which, by the way, the dissertation notes could just be environmental contamination or a common red fungus like Serratia mercescens.
Right, you are going to perceive it as blood.
Yeah.
Because that is what your theological framework tells you to expect.
And once that perception takes hold and it gets declared a miracle, the psychology of institutional commitment just kicks in.
Exactly. The diocese invests resources and credibility. The investigator builds his reputation. The faithful center their devotion around it.
Yeah.
At that point, disproving the miracle becomes incredibly costly, socially, professionally, and spiritually. It isn't that anyone is acting maliciously or in bad faith. It's just that human beings are deeply protective of their established paradigms.
So what does this all mean? After unpacking all of this, the 2006 tissue engineering, the lyophilization, the flawed methodologies, the psychological biases, what is the ultimate takeaway from this dissertation? Does the author conclude it was a deliberate hoax?
The author's conclusion is epistemologically very precise. The paper doesn't strictly prove fraud. You can't definitively prove a negative, and we don't have a confession from a hoaxer.
Okay, fair enough.
However, the author proves that the evidentiary profile of the Tixla host is vastly more consistent with processed, manufactured biological material than it is with a genuine supernatural event.
Wow.
The absence of muscle markers, the shredded DNA coexisting with supposedly active cells, the biological impossibilities of the freshness, all of these arrows point toward human manufacture, not a divine suspension of natural laws.
It completely shifts the burden of proof.
Yeah.
And to make sure investigators don't fall into these same traps in the future, the author actually outlines a rigorous, modernized protocol for any future claims.
It's a phenomenal roadmap, honestly. They demand immediate, time-stamped photographic documentation before anyone even handles the artifacts.
Essential.
Swabbing the environment for fungal contamination, and most importantly, utilizing blinded, independent laboratories that have absolutely no prior connection to miracle investigations or the investigators themselves.
They also recommend using modern forensic tools that weren't utilized here, like full genome sequencing to see if the DNA is actually one contiguous strand.
Yes.
Plus, isotope analysis to trace where the biological material geographically came from, and radiocarbon dating to see if the tissue is actually from the 21st century.
It's a template for methodological humility. And for you listening to this, there is a very practical, everyday application here.
Absolutely.
Whether you are evaluating a religious claim, a viral news story, or an unbelievable pitch for a revolutionary new medical device, extraordinary claims require evidentiary standards that actively account for human ingenuity and our own internal biases.
We have to thoroughly rule out our own capacity to fool ourselves before we rewrite the laws of the universe.
Exactly right.
Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to mull over. We've just spent this entire deep dive looking at what 2006 biotechnology could do to mimic a divine fingerprint.
Yeah, decellularized pig hearts and freeze-dried blood substitutes.
But biotech is advancing at lightning speed. We are currently entering an era of synthetic biology, CRISPR gene editing, 3D bioprinting of actual living organs, and custom DNA synthesis.
The tools are becoming exponentially more sophisticated.
Exactly. So if technology continues to advance to the point where a manufactured event is completely 100% indistinguishable from a supernatural one, right down to the subatomic level, let me rephrase that, right down to the molecular level, how will our scientific and institutional frameworks ever be able to tell the difference between human design and a divine fingerprint?
It is a profound philosophical question. As our tools for creation become increasingly godlike, our tools for detection and our own skepticism are going to have to evolve just as fast.
We might eventually reach a point where the evidence is flawless, and the only thing we have left to rely on is that methodological humility. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.